First encounters with the Vikings. The first notable encounter with the Vikings in Germanic Europe was the attack on Lindisfarne in 793. Lindisfarne was a small island off the coast of the land of the Anglo-Saxons. The only people who lived on it were a group of isolated Christian monks who had spent their lives in devotion to God. On a stormy night, the monks had seen a ship with a dragon carved into it approaching the shore of the island. The Vikings saw the monastery on Lindisfarne as an easy target. They knew that a bunch of monks would not be able to defend themselves. The Vikings landed and broke into the monastery, taking everything that was of value, like gold and silver. The Vikings murdered the monks that showed any form of resistance. The Vikings would even strip them naked and humiliate them before enslaving them to take back to the north. The monks who tried to run away were grabbed and their heads shoved into the water until they drowned. The Danelaw. After decades of Vikings raiding coastal areas of the land of the Anglo-Saxons, a gigantic army from all around the Norse lands, known as the Great Heathen Army, led by Halfdan Ragnarsson and Ivar the Boneless, had conquered into Anglo-Saxon lands and had lightly settled in some areas. The Vikings brutally conquered more and more lands until one of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms decided not to pay the Vikings tribute after they had been plundering and terrorizing them for decades. King Edmund the Martyr was captured by the Vikings and executed. Soon, the majority of the land of the Anglo-Saxons was taken over by the Danelaw. The Danelaw isn't a fully centralized kingdom, but a group of Nordic kingdoms ruling over the Anglo-Saxons. At first, the Norsemen treated the Anglo-Saxons like they were an inferior race, until later on when their control was getting weaker. The descendants of these Vikings would eventually start becoming Christian and losing their Norse pagan beliefs. After decades of Viking rule, the First Kingdom of England would conquer and destroy the Danelaw while attempting to unify the Anglo-Saxons under one kingdom ruled by Edward the Elder and Aethelstan. Beginning of the Holy Roman Empire. In the 900s, the king of East Francia, Otto I, wanted to pick up where Charlemagne went off. Otto had invaded the Kingdom of Italy to get to the city of Rome, where the papacy ruled. After his conquest, he was crowned as the new Roman Emperor. Otto the Great then finally established the Holy Roman Empire, a Christian empire that succeeded the deceased Western Roman Empire. The Holy Roman Empire tried to establish friendly ties to the Byzantine Empire, but they never accepted that there could be a new Roman emperor in the West. After several political conflicts with the Pope, Otto then deposed the Pope and brought a new bishop into the position that was more agreeable to the Holy Roman Empire. Origins of the Habsburgs. During the early 11th century, a fortress was built in Switzerland called the Habsburg Castle. Radbot of Klettau had built this fortress. He would later appoint his son Otto II as the first Count of Habsburg. For the next several centuries, the Habsburg house would become a powerful family that would begin to quietly take over Europe. Norman invasion of Angleland. During the middle of the 11th century, the Anglo-Saxons were trying their hardest to consolidate a central English power before any other Viking conquest could happen. The king of the Anglo-Saxons, named Edward the Confessor, had no children and no heirs to the throne. Two different kings wanted to seize the throne: Harald Hardrada, the king of Norway, and William the Conqueror, the king of Normandy. The Norwegians invaded the northern lands of the Anglo-Saxons, and William invaded the south. The Anglo-Saxons were able to push the Norwegians out of their lands, but stood no chance against the Normans. Now all of the lands of the Anglo-Saxons, and later on the English, were ruled and heavily oppressed by the Empire of Normandy. But this was finally finally the last Viking aggression in Europe, which would signify the end of an era, the end of the Dark Ages, and the beginning of the High Middle Ages. The High Middle Ages would have a lot less chaos and more stability, and Europe would have mostly ethnocentric kingdoms. During this time, feudalism would be much more common, where the church, the royalty, and the nobility would all equally rule over Europe. First Crusade. After the Islamic Seljuk Empire conquered Anatolia from the Byzantine Empire, Pope Urban II was afraid that the Byzantine Empire might be overrun by the Muslims, so he called upon the Catholic Knights of Western Europe to take back Anatolia and return it to Christian rule so that the Byzantine Empire could be restored to its former size. The Pope declared that all knights who participated in the restoration of Byzantine Anatolia were exempt from all previous sins and will make it to heaven. Many Germans from the Holy Roman Empire and Anglo-Saxons from Norman-ruled Angleland, along with Italians, Frenchmen, and Normans, had all gathered together into an army of the Christian God to bring Christendom back to the Near East. At first, some groups of crusaders were so zealous about their religion that they massacred Jews all along their path towards the Byzantine Empire. The Hungarians actually managed to decimate several of these crusader armies. The ones that finally made it to Seljuk-ruled Anatolia were immediately slaughtered by the Seljuk Turks as soon as they crossed over into the Seljuk Empire during the People's Crusade. Eventually, the Byzantine Emperor Alexios Komnenos financed later crusader armies that were better organized. They were then able to conquer a large area of Anatolia. They were led by the noblemen Raymond of Toulouse, Godfrey of Bouillon, and Bohemond of Taranto. Afterwards, the Crusaders wanted something more than to simply give land back to the Byzantine Empire. They wanted to bring all of the Near East back into Christendom. The Crusaders began to march towards the ancient biblical city of Jerusalem, but were vexed by the long siege of Antioch in Lebanon. Finally, the Crusaders arrived in Fatimid-controlled Palestine. The area was no longer populated by the Israelites of the Bible. It was mostly populated by the descendants of Arab Muslims who colonized the region hundreds of years before. The Jewish and the Middle Eastern Christian minorities there were harshly governed by the Fatimids before the Crusaders arrived. The Crusaders besieged the city of Jerusalem and broke into the city walls. They pillaged the city and massacred many civilians who were simply living there. After the successful conquests of the Holy Land, many of the Crusaders had gone back to Europe, while others stayed and established their own Christian theocratic kingdoms known as Crusader states. In Anatolia, there was the Principality of Armenian Cilicia and the County of Edessa. In Lebanon, there was the Principality of Antioch, and in Palestine, there was the County of Tripoli and the Kingdom of Jerusalem. The Holy Roman Empire rejects the papacy. Frederick Barbarossa I had ascended to the throne of the Holy Roman Empire through an electoral process involving the various noblemen of Germany. Frederick then had several conflicts with Pope Adrian IV. After a series of bitter squabblings with the Pope, Frederick had cut all ties with the papacy and declared that the title of Holy Roman Emperor was innately divine and that the Pope had no say in who should or shouldn't be the new emperor. Later Crusades. After the Crusader state of Edessa was reconquered by the Seljuks, a new crusade was declared, except this time the Crusaders failed to recapture Edessa and tried to conquer Damascus in Syria. The Crusaders lost and were pushed back into only occupying a small area of Anatolia. The Third Crusade is usually considered the most glorious crusade. Lionheart was the one who led most of the Crusaders. This crusade was much more religiously motivated and less political than the last two crusades. In the end, they did not recapture Jerusalem, but were able to keep some of the Crusader states intact. The Fourth Crusade was when Crusader knights sacked the Byzantine Empire all around Greece and Anatolia and ruled over the areas for a short time until they were overthrown and the Byzantine Empire was restored to its normal borders. The Fifth Crusade was when the Crusaders attempted to conquer Egypt, which was ruled by the Ayyubid Sultanate. It was unsuccessful since the Sultanate was much more powerful than the European kingdoms. The Sixth Crusade was much less violent and more diplomatic. In an agreement between the Holy Roman Empire and the Ayyubid Sultanate, the areas around Jerusalem and Palestine were given to the Christians. After that, the Germans were no longer participating in the Crusades of Palestine. Teutonic Order and the Northern Crusade. In the Third Crusade of the Holy Land, when the city of Acre was captured by the Christians, there was a German Catholic order of knights that had formed called the Order of Brothers of the German House of St. Mary in Jerusalem. This new Catholic order was modeled off of the Knights Templar, which was more French. After the Christians were pushed out of Palestine once again, they returned back to Europe. Their true calling came when the Polish Duke Conrad of Masovia asked them for aid in Christianizing the last of the Baltic tribes known as the Old Prussians. The Teutonic Knights waged holy war against the pagan Baltic tribes and eliminated paganism in the region. The region that they crusaded would eventually be populated by German settlers who would become the modern Prussians. For a short time, the Teutonic Order had established a crusader state in the Baltic and became a regional power that waged wars with its now Christian neighbors. Medieval Jews in Germany. The Ashkenazi Jews who lived in Germany were treated as normal citizens until the times of the Crusades when Christian hyper-religiosity washed over Western Europe. Jews became hated by the surrounding Christian population since in the Bible, the Jewish Pharisees had Jesus Christ horribly tortured and crucified by the Romans. They were commonly accused of causing the Black Death and satanic ritual killings of children. There were many occurrences of Christians torturing Jews into converting to Christianity or being burned at the stake. Many Christian kingdoms in Western Europe had tried to genocide the Jews. These were called pogroms. These kingdoms would also attempt to expel all Jews from their lands. The Jews were also hated because they were a mercantilist class who often got rich from practicing usury, which Christians were forbidden from doing. This mercantile lifestyle over many generations would cause the Ashkenazi Jews to become the most intelligent ethnic group in the entire world. Most of the German Jews had migrated to Poland and Greater Eastern Europe, since they would be treated less harshly there, mostly because Eastern Europe had been Christianized later on and still had some pagans left. Teutonic Knights and the Mongols. The Teutonic Knights were commanded by Pope Gregory IX to aid the Poles and the Moravians in Central Europe to fight against the approaching invasion by the Mongol Empire. To most Europeans at the time, this was going to be the last stand to save Europe from the ravenous Mongol heathens. In a village near the Polish city of Legnica, the Poles, Moravians, and Teutonic Knights all combined forces and battled with the Mongol horde. In the end, the Mongols had brutally defeated the Europeans in Legnica. It was said that the Mongols cut off the right ears of every dead soldier to count their kills. Henry II of Silesia, the commander of the defeated army, was beheaded, and his head was put on a spear and paraded around for all to see. Later on, the Mongol horde attempted to invade the city of Klodsko, but failed to breach through its defenses. Instead, the Mongols raided and pillaged the surrounding countryside until the entire area was decimated. The Mongols decided to travel south into Hungary instead of invading any further west. Shortly afterwards, the Mongol Empire began to collapse, and many Mongol warriors began to travel back to the Far East to tend to their internal issues. The Europeans began to fight back against the Mongols and may have started using their own gunpowder weapons against them. Black Death. During the times of the Mongol conquests of Europe, They brought a disease with them from the Far East called the bubonic plague. The disease was carried around by infected fleas in the fur of rats. The plague was so contagious that it would spread from animals to humans very easily. The effects usually included severe flu-like symptoms and pus-filled lesions and dead blackened skin around the most infected areas. The illness was very lethal since there were no antibiotics back in the 1300s. It was very easily spread across Europe since people wouldn't try to disinfect themselves and they would closely interact with each other on a daily basis. The plague affected the countryside just as much as the cities. Plague doctors would try to cure this disease with very unscientific methods, which would result in worsened health for themselves and others. Many people at this time had blamed Jews and gypsies for poisoning the wells and heavily persecuted them. No one knew about bacteria and how diseases spread back then. Most of Europe was clueless about how to stop the bubonic plague. Another explanation was that God supposedly was punishing the Europeans for their sins. Many highly religious people started to go out into the streets and flog themselves to show their devotion to God during these times. Around 200 million people had been killed off by the bubonic plague. Yet there would still be more waves of the Black Death after the first one, but people started gaining immunities to the disease over time, and each wave got less and less devastating to the population. End of the Teutonic Kingdoms. In the early 1400s, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth fought the Teutonic Knights over the pagan Baltic region of Samogitia, which was one of the last majority pagan areas in Europe. The Lithuanians, even though they were mostly Christian, still had a soft spot for the pagans since they just were pagans a short time ago. Samogitian uprisings against the ruling Teutonic kingdoms were backed by the Commonwealth. The new Teutonic leader, Ulrich, declared war on the Commonwealth and invaded into Poland. In the Battle of Grunwald, the Teutonic Knights were disorganized, which made them more vulnerable. Most of the Teutonic Knights were massacred in this battle by the Poles, Lithuanians, and Hungarians. After this war was over, the Teutonic Order would become less and less powerful and influential as time went on. It was the end of an era. Throughout the 1400s, several major events in Europe would happen which would cause the modern Western civilization to rise as the next great civilization in the world. The High Middle Ages were gradually drawing to a close. Rise of the Habsburgs. The Habsburg family, after ruling over a small area of Switzerland, had allied with a larger family nearby called the Hohenstaufen dynasty during the 1100s. By the 1200s, the Habsburg family became significantly richer and more powerful within the Holy Roman Empire, inheriting more land in Switzerland. Rudolf of Habsburg conquered more land in Austria and became the first Habsburg king of Germany. Later, the second Habsburg king of Germany attempted to expand the Habsburg family's power and influence into Bohemia and Thuringia, but they both teamed together and defeated Albert's armies. After failing to expand the power and influence of his dynasty, there would be no more Habsburg kings of Germany for quite some time. The son of Albert, Frederick of Habsburg, lost a civil war in the Habsburg territories and got captured by Ludwig of Bavaria in the 1300s. His younger brother, Albert, then succeeded Frederick. Albert improved the Habsburg lands during his reign and made several smart alliances. Albert was succeeded by his son, Rudolf. Rudolf had succeeded in expanding the territory and influence of the Habsburg family into the land of Tyrol during his short reign. He also made the city of Vienna into the capital of his dynasty, and the University of Vienna was created by then. His sons Albert and Leopold succeeded the throne and split the Habsburg lands amongst themselves. Shortly afterwards, the territories divided further and became almost different dynasties during the 1400s. The ancestral Habsburg lands were then conquered by the Swiss. Albert V of Habsburg formed an alliance with the more powerful King Sigismund and later succeeded the throne of Germany for the first time in 130 years. He also became the king of both Hungary and Bohemia and fought in wars against the Ottoman Empire. Frederick of Habsburg succeeded him and became the new king of Germany. Frederick had to fight wars of infighting within his own borders. Finally, Frederick became the first Habsburg Holy Roman Emperor. Frederick fought more wars against the encroaching Ottoman Empire. Frederick and the French fought over the lands of Burgundy. Frederick's son Maximilian continued to fight the French in Burgundy until a treaty was made where he inherited half of the land. The Black Army invaded and conquered several of Frederick's lands. Maximilian later reconquered the lands lost by Frederick. The Habsburg lands were all reunited in the later 1400s. Maximilian succeeded his father as the new ruler of the Habsburg dynasty. Under his rule, Maximilian further innovated his lands. Maximilian regularly fought wars against the French and the Venetians. Maximilian's son, Philip the Fair, had married into Castilian royalty but died shortly after, making his son Charles succeed him and inherit the kingdoms of Castile and Aragon. Charles was secured as the Holy Roman Emperor, ruler of all Habsburg lands, the King of Germany, Burgundy, Aragon, and Castile. He was, at this point, the most powerful man in the Western world. Renaissance. After the fall of Rome about 1,000 years before, massive amounts of ancient knowledge of antiquity was lost. There was still some classical works that were intact, however. It was mostly held by the Islamic civilization. A lot of this ancient intellectual literature was added onto by the Arab, Iranian, and Turkic Muslims all throughout Europe's Dark Ages. The Islamic Golden Age was the successor to classical antiquity. The Muslims discovered new types of math, philosophy, and science. In the late 1300s, the Venetians created a maritime trading kingdom and traded with the Ottoman Empire. The Italians finally recovered all of this ancient and medieval knowledge and built beautiful cities and went into an artistic golden age. But this golden age was mostly during the 1400s. It wouldn't be until the end of the 1400s and the beginning of the 1500s when the Renaissance would spread all throughout the rest of Europe, including Germany. Germany, along with several other countries in northwestern Europe, had small groups of people who began questioning the doctrines of traditional Christianity and studied other more esoteric forms of spirituality. This was the advent of occultism and Hermeticism in Renaissance Europe. There was much more Renaissance architecture being built at this time, where it was inspired by the ancient Romans and Muslims' arabesque architecture. And finally, the art becomes a lot more sophisticated. And eventually, feudalism starts to die out as more and more peasants from the countryside begin to migrate into the urban cities. Feudalism would slowly die out and be replaced by a form of early mercantilism. Martin Luther and the Protestant Reformation. After a series of financial abuses done by the Pope, Martin Luther wrote the famous 95 Theses, which heavily criticized the Catholic Church and the papacy. Martin Luther triggered a massive schism in Christendom called the Protestant Reformation, mainly between the more Germanic northern areas of Western Europe and the more Latin areas of southwestern Europe. Germany itself was very divided among Catholics and Protestants. The beliefs of Protestantism or Lutheranism is that priests, bishops, and popes should not have the authority to determine whether or not someone goes to hell. They believed that there was just a heaven and a hell and no purgatory or any other supernatural world besides that. They believed that everyone should have a Bible to read themselves and interpret the Word of God on their own, instead of having the Bible read to them by a priest that would interpret scripture in a way favorable to the corrupt Catholic Church. Martin Luther, in the earlier 1500s, was excommunicated by the Catholic Church. Luther had become an outlaw and seen as a heretic deserving of death by many, so he fled into hiding and assumed a new identity. After a period of exile, he returned back to civilization and began the Church of Lutheranism. During the Ottoman invasions of Central Europe, Luther wrote many criticisms on the religion of Islam and began to hypothesize that the end times were closely approaching. Luther would also write negatively about the Jews, saying that they were a rejected people guilty of the murder of Christ. During his final years of life, Luther became a bitter old man due to his declining health, and it showed in his later works. In the middle of the 1500s, Luther had died from complications of old age. After his death, his church would grow and prosper throughout many lands and other continents. Faust. Little is known about the actual historical Faust. Most likely he was born around the mid to late 1400s. He was likely born in the southwest German town of Nittlingen. Johann Georg Faust was known for performing magic tricks throughout various towns in southern Germany. He also seemed to have taken the role of doctors, philosophers, astrologers, and alchemists. He was seen as blasphemous towards the Christian God and fraudulent. The Catholic Church condemned him for his behavior and stated that he was colluding with Satan. Other rumors stated that he was allegedly a child predator. Around 1540, he supposedly died from a chemical explosion from his alchemy in Hotel Zum Lohen in Staufen im Breisgau. After his death, he was turned into a folk legend. The legend of Faust is about a man who spent his life using black magic, who grew depressed with his old age and becomes suicidal. He wishes upon hell that he could have riches and youth. The devil hears his wishes and sends a demon named Mephistopheles to bargain with him that he can have all of the riches and his youth back and all of the power he wants, only if he gives his soul to the devil and sent to hell after death. Faust agrees and gets everything he ever wanted in life, but in the end, he is carried off to hell. Siege of Vienna. The Ottoman Empire, the last great power of the Islamic civilization, had recently destroyed the dying remains of the Byzantine Empire in Constantinople. They were finally able to breach into the rugged Balkans region of Europe and conquer several Christian kingdoms. The Ottoman rule over these historically Christian lands was an unequal mix of tolerance and oppression. As the Ottomans were brutally decimating the once powerful kingdom of Hungary, the Habsburg-ruled Austrians waged several wars against them. They had even gained the approval of Martin Luther to continue fighting the Ottoman armies to save Europe from what he considered to be an evil heretical state. The Ottoman Empire under Suleiman the Magnificent attempted to invade the city of Vienna in the heart of the Habsburg dynasty. The city was very heavily fortified and defended with professional Landsknecht mercenaries. The weather was also by their side during the siege of Vienna. Under the command of Niklas Graf Salm, the Ottomans were unable to capture the city. Albrecht Dürer was born in the German city of Nuremberg. Ever since he was a child, he was naturally gifted with drawing and later decided not to pursue the family trade of metalworking. He was taught how to paint by Michael Wohlgemuth. He had painstakingly cultivated his artistic skills for 4 years until he began to travel across Germanic Europe. He married a woman named Agnes Frey. They would never have children together for unknown reasons. He had spent time in Italy to bring back some of the more flamboyant and liberal artistic styles to Germany. He would go on to create several iconic self-portrait paintings. He also painted many religious scenes involving Jesus Christ and even the end times. Albrecht would eventually become a renowned artist and met with the artist Raphael. Albrecht often collaborated with other contemporary artists. Albrecht had met with Martin Luther and became a Protestant himself. After traveling overseas, he had caught malaria and never truly recovered. During his middle age, he had died from various health complications. His contemporaries mourned his passing and exhumed his body. German Venezuela. During the late 1400s, Europeans had discovered an entirely new gigantic landmass in the Atlantic Ocean that was named America. Throughout the later decades, the Spanish and Portuguese empires had been exploring, conquering, and colonizing as much of North and South America they could. Like the Islamic caliphates hundreds of years before, the Spaniards attempted to spread the religion of Christianity by the sword in the Americas. They also saw these lands as profitable and began importing thousands of slaves from south of the Sahara Desert for free labor. During the early mid-1500s, a powerful German banking family called the Westlers of Augsburg were given a large amount of barely explored land in South America that was then named Klein Venedig. Charles V of Habsburg was in debt to the banking family and couldn't pay them off, so he had to give them one of his New World colonies. The Westlers played a significant role in the Atlantic slave trade that had already been going on in the Americas. The Westlers built a few colonial settlements which they could only populate with Spanish settlers and very few German settlers. These German settlers would either marry into the Spanish colonist families or Native American families. The ones who never mixed into other populations had died of incurable tropical diseases later on. The Germans fought several Native American tribes, the most notable being the Coquivacoa tribe. A German explorer named Nikolaus Federmann ventured deeper into the jungles of Klein Venedig and even illegally crossed into the nearby colonies of Guyana and Colombia and established more colonial settlements. Another German explorer named Philipp von Speyer led an expedition to find the fabled city of El Dorado, which was an unsuccessful venture. While exploring the deep jungle, they encountered the Kambeba tribe, who seemed to be significantly wealthier than the other surrounding tribes. They had many strange cultural practices, such as head flattening of infants, to create elongated skulls as a sign of prestige. After many years of conquering native tribes, exploring new lands, and establishing new settlements, an imperial Spaniard named Juan de Carvajal took back control of Klein Venedig and it was renamed to Venezuela. This ended all further German influence in the region. Spanish Netherlands. In the mid to late 1500s, the Netherlands had been inherited by the Habsburg dynasty and automatically became part of the Spanish Empire since Spain was ruled by a Habsburg king named Philip II. The Habsburgs and the Spanish were devout Catholics since Austria was their homeland. The Netherlands, however, were devoutly Protestant. During the times of the Spanish Inquisition, the ruling Spanish had tried to crack down on the growth of the Protestant denomination Calvinism and forcefully re-establish Catholicism in the region. This Dutch Inquisition was enacted by Cardinal Antoine de Grenville, which sparked an event called the Iconoclastic Fury, where the Calvinists started destroying Catholic statues and imagery in cathedrals all over the Netherlands. A man named William of Orange was one of the main Dutch Calvinist nobles who openly opposed the Spanish rule and inspired the Dutch commoners to resist the Inquisition. More civil unrest ensued, causing a Spanish army led by Fernando de Toledo, the Duke of Alba, to crush the insurrections. William of Orange fled into Germany to escape from him. Fernando executed several other nobles who promoted religious freedom. William later organized an armed resistance against the Spanish occupation. The Dutch revolt had officially begun. Landsknechts. The Landsknechts were an army of mercenaries who mostly used pikes during battle. They had a very good fashion sense, wearing very colorful and flamboyant clothes. They were very formidable against the enemies of the Habsburgs. They were also used to fight in religious wars between Catholics and Protestants all throughout Europe. Maximilian of Habsburg was the first one to deploy these mercenaries in the later 1400s. They had developed a new unique warrior culture similar to the samurai of feudal Japan. The weapons that the Landsknechts used included the flamberge, the Zweihander, and the Arquebus, and others. Most of the mercenaries recruited into the Landsknecht regiments were from southern Germany, in places such as Baden, Bavaria, Franconia, Tyrol, Württemberg, and the Rhineland. Over the course of the 1500s, the Landsknechts were constantly having to adapt to rapid technological advances in Western warfare. Towards the end of their time, most of them were using early firearms instead of pikes and had become mostly musketeers, but they would slowly be less used as their technology and tactics became increasingly outdated during the 1600s. Dutch revolts. As William of Orange was attempting to liberate the Spanish Netherlands, his army was suffering losses in the inland regions. His navy, however, was successful in capturing the coastal areas. For unrelated reasons, the Spanish Empire became bankrupt, causing the Spanish troops in the Netherlands to resort to rioting and looting across various towns and cities. This was called the Spanish Fury. A treaty called the Pacification of Ghent had begun a short period of peace, which only led to a rise of religious tensions between Catholics and Calvinists. It escalated into the Netherlands dividing into two factions: the Union of Arras in the south, which was more Catholic and pro-Spanish, and the Union of Utrecht in the north, which was more Calvinist and anti-Spanish. The Union of Utrecht won many battles against the Spanish Empire and established its independence as its own sovereign nation, called the United Provinces. Shortly after the revolt, the United Provinces were very disorganized under William of Orange, which led to his assassination. The Spanish Empire had re-invaded the Netherlands and conquered the capital city of Antwerp, causing many Dutch Calvinists to take refuge in the north, mainly in the city of Amsterdam. After not being able to find suitable monarchs to rule the Netherlands, a republic was created. Reign of the Habsburgs. During the early mid-1500s, Emperor Charles V of Habsburg Spain had many rivals: the Kingdom of France and the Ottoman Empire. Charles and Francis I of France waged several wars against each other. As mentioned before, the Habsburgs had held out against the Ottoman Turks in the Siege of Vienna. In the Western Mediterranean, piracy was very prominent because of the Algerians. The Algerian pirates became vassals of the Ottoman Empire and would often attack Spanish ships. Charles then commanded a Spanish invasion of the city of Tunis, the capital of this empire of piracy. Charles was emperor of the Holy Roman Empire during the times of the Protestant Reformation. He was very intolerant of the Protestants and would have them burned at the stake for heresy against the Catholic Church. Charles crushed several noble Protestant rebellions throughout the Holy Roman Empire. He eventually grew old and stressed and stepped down from power. He gave his brother Ferdinand the Habsburg lands of Austria and let him inherit the title of Holy Roman Emperor. Charles's son Philip inherited the throne of the Spanish Empire. King Philip of Habsburg Spain was known for being a tyrannical Catholic religious zealot. He regularly had Protestants and Jews burned at the stake for heresy. He hoped to take over the entire world and dominate a global monarchy. The center of Philip's new empire was the city of Madrid and Castile. France had been plunged into civil war and wasn't much of a threat to the Spanish Empire anymore. Philip was the king of Spain during the Dutch revolts. He would send the Duke of Alba to brutally crush the revolts, but eventually the Spanish forces would ultimately lose to the Dutch rebels. Both Philip's son and wife had died, and he was left without an heir. There was a massive naval battle with the Ottomans in the Mediterranean Sea near Lepanto in Greece, which ended in a stalemate. The Ottomans were pushed back towards the eastern Mediterranean, while the Spanish were pushed back towards the western Mediterranean. Philip's nephew, King Sebastian of Portugal, led a crusade into Islamic Morocco. He died in battle and had no heir. Since there were no heirs to the Portuguese seize throne, Philip had invaded and successfully taken over Portugal and its entire massive colonial empire. This was the origin of the Iberian Union. Because of the English aiding the Dutch rebels, Philip attempted to have Queen Elizabeth of England assassinated. His plan failed, and the Spanish Armada was sent straight towards England to invade. But the powerful English navy had completely decimated the Spanish fleets. Philip later tried to invade France because of its new Protestant king. He eventually failed to conquer the French as well. The empire fell into bankruptcy while Philip was growing old. Philip's new son, Philip III, had succeeded him as the new king of Iberia. Philip III was not the greatest ruler of the empire and relied heavily on his unofficial prime ministers. During his reign, he had expelled a massive number of people called the Moriscos out of the Iberian Peninsula. The Moriscos were the descendants of Muslims during the Al-Andalus, who were forced to convert to Christianity. This had heavily depopulated Iberia. The Austrian branch of the Habsburg dynasty, ruled by King Ferdinand, along with other Habsburg-ruled territories in the region, were afraid of the increasing Ottoman threat in the Balkans. In the Battle of Mohacs, Ferdinand's brother Louis was killed and had no heirs to his throne. Ferdinand inherited his brother's lands and wanted to take control of Hungary as another part of his inheritance. But the Hungarian nobles resisted the Habsburg takeover, so they allied with the Ottoman Empire and asked them to aid in removing the approaching Habsburg rule from Hungary. The Ottomans ended up taking control of Hungary and invaded into Austria. This was when the Siege of Vienna happened. As a result of the battle, Austria was not under Ottoman rule and was only able to inherit parts of the Kingdom of Hungary. After the death of Ferdinand, the Habsburg lands were divided between his successors. Rudolf II had inherited the largest of these partitioned lands. He was a more peaceful ruler, valuing education rather than wartime prowess. Despite this, he was a devout Catholic and tried to re-establish Catholicism in his homeland. Protestant nobles were the majority in his lands, however. Rudolf would later wage unnecessary wars against the Ottomans, which would backfire into stalemates. During the last few years of Rudolf's reign, tensions were brewing between the Catholics and the Protestants. They had each formed factions, the Protestant Union and the Catholic League. A massive, catastrophic war was approaching. Rudolf was succeeded by his younger brother Matthias. A bishop named Klesel was being counted on by Matthias to find common ground between Catholics and Protestants to prevent a massive conflict, but ultimately failed to do so. Matthias had no heirs, so there were several other Habsburgs trying to claim the throne. An event called the Defenestration of Prague had happened where militant Protestants stormed the residence of several Catholic governors. This event would start the 30 Years' War, which would greatly devastate the Habsburg family's political power. The 30 Years' War. It was an extremely turbulent time in Europe during the 1500s and 1600s. Due to the rise of Protestantism, religious conflict and war had spread all across Western Europe, but none were as bloody and brutal as the 30 Years' War. This was what seemed to be the ultimate fight between the Catholics and Protestants. This specific war started when the Holy Roman Emperor Ferdinand II had started imposing absolutist Catholic laws upon his home region of Bohemia, which was majority Protestant. The noble Protestant Bohemians and Austrians started to revolt in 1618, which was the start of the 30 Years' War. The Baltic during this time was vulnerable to attack. The Kingdom of Denmark, under King Christian IV, attempted to invade the area, but the Swedes conquered and overthrew the Kingdom of Denmark before they could re-establish their foothold after losing it to the Swedes in an earlier conflict. After the Swedish King Gustav II, Adolf, had won a war against Poland, he attempted to invade further south into Germany to try to purge the Catholic tyranny from the land. Most of the war was fought in German towns and cities where large civilian populations were annihilated. Over half of the population of the Holy Roman Empire had been killed during this war. The mercenaries, who were usually the ones doing all of the fighting, were severely underpaid, causing them to raid small towns for all of their resources. The Treaty of Westphalia had finally ended the 30 Years' War. The wars between the Catholics and Protestants were fewer and farther between after this point. Eventually, Europeans would gradually become less hyper-religious during the coming Age of Reason. The Holy Roman Empire now ceases to be a major European power and just becomes a loose alliance of small German principalities and duchies.